The mixed blessings during the immediate aftermath of universal suffrage. The American Civil War was a time of tremendous progress for African Americans. In the North, African Americans had established themselves as equals on the battlefield to many and blown through many stereotypes as prominent figures like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass rose to fame as activists. In the case of Tubman, she grew to fame as a spy for the North. On the battlefield, black regiments like the 54th Massachusetts Infantry bravely proved their capacity on the battlefield while facing certain execution in the case of capture. In 1863, the 54th proved their loyalty to the Union as well as their ability to fight during their charge on Fort Wagner. An article from the New York Times published May 29, 1863 spoke of the regiment as such. One of the most enthusiastic, exciting, and demonstrative local military events of the war took place today. To commemorate the departure of the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment for South Carolina. The ranks of the regiment were entirely full. The men were dressed in regular United States uniform and were splendidly equipped. They were headed by a full band of colored musicians. The regiment made a magnificent appearance. After being reviewed on Boston Common by Governor John A. Andrew and his staff, the regiment embarked on the fine new steamer Demolay, which is set to sail immediately. The march of this splendid regiment through the city was attended by the most enthusiastic cheering, and such vast crowds as lined the streets have seldom before been seen. The regiment was greeted all along their march with tremendous cheers, and they presented a most soldierly and imposing appearance. Already, by the conclusion of the war, African Americans were respected as capable free laborers in the new Union. They had won the support of a sizable proportion of Congress and eventually earned their freedom. Coming in the form of the 13th Amendment, passed on April 8, 1864, and then by the House of Representatives on January 31, 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Southern battlefield victories driven by the labor of African Americans led to the new Republican perception of slaves as good workers and eventually to the understanding among Republican leaders that African Americans would only need jobs and wages to participate effectively in a free labor society. The surrender of Robert E. Lee and his army at Appomattox on April 9, 1865 brought great release to the North. The sacrifice of greater than 600,000 men had rid the United States of slavery and finally allowed for a nation with great potential to move forward and claim its destiny as God's favored land of the free. However, the relief of the war's end only survived for a few days. On April 15, 1865, the nation was informed of the death of Abraham Lincoln, his vacancy being filled by the lenient Southern sympathetic Andrew Johnson. The Tennessean made a plan to move forward with Reconstruction on his own terms. Johnson's restoration plan made an oath of allegiance the only requirement for amnesty and restoration of property to all but high-ranking Confederate officers, as well as aristocratic individuals who were worth more than $20,000. Those white men who made the oath of allegiance to the Union could participate in elections of delegates to state conventions. The conventions were only required to abolish slavery, nullify state ordinances of secession, and repudiate the Confederate debt. Johnson's leniency encouraged Southerners to attempt to resurrect their pre-war society. White gangs terrorized ex-slaves, torturing and killing freed people. Meanwhile, many state organizations institutionalized the harassment. The new Southern legislatures also passed the Black Codes, which dangerously mimic slavery. In South Carolina, African Americans cannot work as anything other than agricultural laborers without a license. Louisiana provided that blacks commit to year-long labor contracts. And Mississippi commanded that blacks cannot buy farmland, keeping blacks under the thumb of powerful whites yet again. Johnson allowed for these atrocities to take place and readmitted all of the Confederate states but Texas into the Union. Later, the 14th Amendment was ratified. giving African Americans equal protection under the law. This still fell short of guaranteeing African Americans the right to vote. Republicans had long understood the vote as the only way a man could protect his economic rights. Moderate and radical Republicans alike reasoned that without the vote, a man would be at the mercy of any government that chose to tax his property or even confiscate it. This line of thought made suffrage as much of an economic right as a political one in the eyes of many lawmakers. Radical Republican minds such as Carl Schurz saw suffrage for African Americans as the quickest and most natural way to carry out Reconstruction in the South. To quote Schurz, "In all questions concerning the Union, the national debt, and the future social organization of the South, the feelings of the colored man are naturally in sympathy with the views and aims of the national government." Conclusions such as this were born out of the realization that the addition of 4 million freed people to the census would increase the South's representation in Congress dramatically, threatening to increase the Democratic representation in government by a large measure. Discussions of African American suffrage brought immediate anguish out of the white Southerners fearful of losing their upper hand over African Americans. Few Southerners shared the confidence radical Republicans had in African Americans as contributors to a free labor society and to the government which would run that society. That fear, without a doubt, came from the reasoning that the granting of African American suffrage would run against the traditional belief that to understand one's own interests, one must be educated. The vast majority of freedmen were illiterate, and in 1866, even delegates at the Georgia Freedmen Convention could not agree to endorse universal suffrage. Despite this, Republicans pushed on with their goal, believing universal suffrage to be the only solution to racial conflict in the South. As the Philadelphia Inquirer explained, the vote would be the best permanent protection against oppressive class legislation, as well as against individual persecution. Unfortunately, however, little action and dialogue took place to ensure that these sorts of measures could be forced into place at the time of their realization. Standing firm, congressional Republicans passed the Military Reconstruction Act on March 2, 1867, over President Andrew Johnson's veto. The act called for the organization of Southern conventions to rewrite Southern constitutions. Congressional Republicans stipulated that the convention's delegates would be elected by universal manhood suffrage, giving the freedmen a vote. Radical Republican Thaddeus Stevens justified the action in this summation: "If it be just, it should not be denied. If it be necessary, it should be adopted. If it be a punishment to traitors, they deserve it." Republican politician James G. Blaine later wrote that the Military Reconstruction Act was of transcendent importance and unprecedented character. It was the most vigorous and determined action ever taken by Congress in time of peace. Ex-slaves rejoiced in the summer of 1867. However, some Southern whites saw it as a time to unite as a white man's party, intimidating and harassing ex-slaves who threatened to usurp some white men in society. In this new society, the vast majority of prominent African American leaders were usually freedborn, educated, and somewhat prosperous. According to the census in North Carolina in 1870, biracial or mulatto black men were 4 times more likely than those listed as black to own land. These black leaders usually preached the idea of working hard to achieve prosperity, while ex-slaves struggled mightily to move vertically. In many cases, freed people continued working for their former masters and were hindered by the black codes. Southern freed people tended to view the world as a struggle between the haves and the have-nots. The Union League worked to organize freedmen in the South after the war. It had black leaders as organizers and worked hard to address the concerns of ex-slaves. They believed that they were voicing the true needs of the freedmen who sought to be incorporated into a free labor economy. But impoverished ex-slaves quickly realized that the Union League was not willing to push for the clear solutions to the attempt by white Southerners to revert to their antebellum state. The Union League refused to back land confiscation for ex-slaves and blindly led people into the belief that hard work alone would allow for blacks to ascend in the Southern economic system. Several members of the Union League did reach political power, however. Calling for the right to hold office, an African American named Theophilus Ashe was elected one of the town commissioners of Plymouth, North Carolina. Demands by the Union League and their momentum into taking public office shocked white Southerners who were intimidated by demands for a 50-50 black and white police force, as well as black mayors. White Southerners feared economic bankruptcy as a result of African American office holders due to their perceived lack of mental capacity, as well as, ironically, the potential for unfair treatment of whites. Despite all concerns, in February of 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed with the goal of solidifying African American voting rights. With too little pressure from radical Republicans, the version of the 15th Amendment that passed only protected men's ability to not be denied the vote on the basis of skin color, race, and previous position of servitude, making no mention of preventing disenfranchisement on the basis of property ownership, education, tax-paying requirements, or residency. Lawmakers essentially did nothing to eliminate the possibility of barring African Americans from the vote by indirect means. This is one of the great failures of the radical Republicans during Reconstruction. At the conclusion of Andrew Johnson's presidency and the beginning of Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, the Reconstruction movement made a pivot. Powerful voices among the radical Republicans such as Carl Schurz lost some of their investment in securing and ensuring rights for African Americans, while moderate Republicans in the new administration sought to shore up Reconstruction as soon as possible, satisfied with what they had received from the 14th and 15th Amendments. Somewhat forgotten about, African Americans began to feel the consequences of poor Reconstruction strategy. Circumstances such as these led to a wave of terrorism and organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK used intimidation tactics such as lynchings to keep African Americans away from the polls and intimidate Unionists into hiding. Simultaneously, a deep drop-off in vigor on the part of the radical Republicans caused the Freed People's Rights advocates' actions to become less and less noticed. Despite legislation taken against the KKK, their intimidation persisted and prevented African Americans and Unionists from getting their proponents into power in the South. Rather than bringing out decisive action from African Americans and radical Republicans, terrorist organizations were allowed to force radical Republicans and African Americans into a deeper submission. The momentum of the KKK, as well as other terrorist organizations, and the desire among many whites to return the United States to a racial hierarchy eventually summed up in the disenfranchisement of many African Americans throughout the late 1800s and until 1965 by means of the Grandfather Clause, felony disenfranchisement, and literacy tests. In many ways, the United States regressed for a period after 1870 and made many African Americans wait much longer than anticipated for their right to participate in the United States government and labor system freely. African Americans were largely deprived of the right to have a say in what shall become of their government and their personal rights.